Warning: suicide and death. This content addresses mental health issues, including research and narratives on suicide. Please take care while engaging with it and only proceed if you feel safe doing so. If you or someone you love is having thoughts of suicide, please contact 988. Help is available. Welcome. I'm your host, Lisa Meeks. This is the third episode in our series on mental health and suicide in medical training. If you haven't listened to the earlier episodes, I encourage you to start with episode 102, the first in the series, for important context. In today's episode, we'll explore how certain aspects of medical training can contribute to stress and hinder well-being. We'll focus on competitive environments where performance is prioritized over self-care, the pressures tied to high-stakes exams and residency match, and the unique challenges faced by learners with disabilities. We'll also hear more from the Ruddell family about how Jack Ruddell experienced some of these stressors. It's important to emphasize that we are not blaming medical education alone for learners' mental health struggles. Instead, we aim to understand how the unique pressures and demands of training can incubate pre-existing challenges and contribute to the emergence of new mental health difficulties. Our goal is not to assign blame, but to explore ways to reshape the structures and culture of medical training, fostering an environment where learners can thrive and maintain both their mental and physical well-being. We begin with our consult psychiatrist and narrator, Dr. Joseph Murray.
Welcome back to the series. Before we continue, I want to issue a content warning. Today's episode includes discussions about depression, suicidality, and the ways medical training structures can undermine well-being and discourage help-seeking behaviors. We'll explore these issues through the story of Dr. Jack Ruddell, who died by suicide, and with insights from Drs. Jessi Gold, Justin Bullock, and David Muller. If this content feels overwhelming, please take care of yourself by stepping away when needed. If you or someone you know is struggling with mental health or suicidal thoughts, you can call or text 988 to reach the Suicide and Crisis Lifeline for support. Asking for help is a sign of strength, and you are not alone. We begin with Dr. David Muller, Director of the Institute for Equity and Justice in Health Sciences Education, Dean Emeritus of Medical Education, and Professor of Medical Education and Medicine at the Icahn School of Medicine at Mount Sinai. Dr. Muller reflects on ways in which the current landscape of medical education might contribute to poor well-being.
From everything that I've seen, students who are coming into the medical school environment are profoundly anxious. They know that they've sort of made it to the next level. They know from all of what they've heard from peers, all of what they've read, all of what they've seen, that it is incredibly intense. It's going to be far more academically, intellectually challenging than anything you've ever done. They hear that over and over again, to the point where it's actually pretty true that the amount of information they need to absorb, process, it's just remarkable. And they know instinctively that they are surrounded by super smart people. The imposter syndrome piece of it is overwhelming for almost all students. And even if they didn't feel imposter syndrome, at some level they know that they are in a group of people who are at least as smart as they are. You're no longer the best in the class, which is what it took to get into medical school. Now you're just another really good person in the class. And who knows how it will turn out, right? There's also that uncertainty. All of that has to be sublimated. Like, you have to literally pretend that all of that stuff going on in your head is not really happening in order to jump into the deep end of the pool. Otherwise, they would run screaming for the doors on the first day of orientation when they looked around and heard all of the names of schools, of places, people, publications that everyone's already, because there's a little bit of that chatter too. They're still pretty stressed out. They no longer have to deal with the nightmare scenario of someone's going to find out on day number 2 that I actually don't belong here. So I think it takes a bold confidence to ignore all of that stuff that's going on and just push through those first few days, weeks, for some, maybe months.
As Dr. Muller highlights, the transition to medical school can be both startling and destabilizing for students who may be accustomed to consistent success. For many intellectually gifted learners, past academic achievements may have come relatively easily. However, the shift to medical education, with its rapid influx of information and high-pressure environment, changes everything. We asked Dr. Muller whether the environment of medical education has worsened for today's medical students.
I know it's gotten worse. Everything that I can think of is evidence that it's gotten worse. Every application to medical school is shocking in the breadth and depth of things that these students have accomplished. It's superhuman. And then, we blithely say, oh, if I had applied to medical school today, I would never have gotten in. I mean, you hear people say that. That's like the standard line from the admissions committee. And they say it with the best of intentions and with great pride on all that these students have managed to accomplish. But that's not a human level of achievement. I mean, what did that take? Forget about the resources and students who come from under-resourced communities and all that aside. What kind of human being do you have to be in order to accomplish that? And whoever said that's what you needed to do to become a great doctor? I don't know where that came from other than our own inflated sense of ego.
Dr. Jessi Gold, Chief Wellness Officer for the University of Tennessee System, Associate Professor of Psychiatry at the University of Tennessee Health Science Center, and author of How Do You Feel?, agrees and expands on how the culture of medical training can erode mental health. She reflects on the pressure medical students face, often without the time or space to reflect on their personal motivations and well-being.
Someone asked me once why I thought med students had such high rates of mental health issues and struggles. And I said, because they never asked themselves why they were doing what they were doing. And I think that is the way we've become physicians. You don't really have time to ask. You are in college and you have to take all these classes already, and it doesn't give you a chance to be in college, to explore, to make friends, to have other interests. You don't really have the time to pause and make sure that what you're doing is what you want to be doing, or explore other fields, or have fun with friends in the interim. And you never really said, am I sure this is what I want to do? Or do I know? Am I sure? Then you have 1 month in a specialty and you're somehow supposed to decide what you're going to do for the rest of your life from 1 month, maximum 8 weeks, probably. If you told anyone else that they were deciding a career for the rest of their life based on a month, that just doesn't make any sense. But then once you're there being a resident, it's really hard to switch fields. It's really, really hard. Not only are there no spots for the most part, it's just logistically hard. And people say a lot of things about you that you don't want said, about you not cutting it. And when are you along that way allowed to go, who am I? What am I interested in? Do I really like this? Why am I becoming a doctor? What do I like about being a doctor? What does that mean to me? Where do I derive meaning? You just don't have the time or the capacity because you just want to keep going and you don't want to fail and you don't have time to breathe. And in that context, how are you supposed to develop coping skills or healthy habits? Because again, you look next to you and the other person's not sleeping and you need to beat them because there's only 2 residency spots to be a neurosurgeon. So you look and you say, well, that person stays up all night. they're going to beat me because they've been staying up all night. I have to stay up all night. So you learn not to sleep. Or you learn if you're yawning that someone's going to call you out for being tired and wimpy. And so you start to ignore physical body sensations too. Like as much as we start to ignore feelings because feelings get in the way, so do illnesses, eating, sleeping, having to pee. And so you just really learn, ignore my emotional experience. That doesn't count. Ignore my physical one. And my physical one only counts if I'm so sick that I would be hospitalized.
The pressures of medical training are not only institutional, but deeply personal. The environment often rewards emotional toughness in the appearance of invincibility, leaving little room for vulnerability. Roja returns to reflect on the experiences of navigating a culture where admitting to struggles can have serious consequences.
People see you differently, and not just from classmates. I think, if anything, most of our classmates, if and when we had the opportunity to really see each other in those lights, were incredibly supportive. But with mentors, it's tough when you're in an environment where toughness and the ability to be invincible through dealing with people dying all the time in difficult situations and staying up all night, the ability to show that you don't feel that or that you can get through it without any problems is rewarded. And when people show that they struggle with normal human things to struggle with, like death at your footstep every single day, having 28-year-old patients die in front of you and coding them and nobody talking to you or helping you process that, it's hard. And most people just bottle it up because sharing that it's hard ends up in situations where you're ridiculed, ends up in situations where people will say to your face that you're weak, ends up in situations where it impacts your letters of recommendation or evaluations, it impacts your ability to go on to residency or whatever's next. And the sad thing is probably 70% of our attendings weren't in that camp of people, but you don't know who the people who will penalize you are. Part of the hidden curriculum in clinical rotations is you're taught to keep your feelings to yourself.
Can you describe Jack's experience in medical school and some of those things that are fairly normative in medical education training that caused him distress?
Jack loved medical school. You know, he loved the challenge. He loved the opportunity to learn and to gain experience and to ultimately begin to deal with patients. So Jack did really thrive at some level. He really, really admired and had deep friendships with many of his classmates. Mm-hmm. So Jack's life at med school was one where he was energized and he was driven to learn. But I think the real experience of med school just became clear once he began, and some of it was unexpected. One example of that is the importance that he understood was placed on research. From a very early stage, he began to understand that it was very important outside of class and outside of the curriculum to try to get involved in research projects, become a member of a team, and ideally become a co-author on an article that might get published or two, because that is a differentiator. That's looked upon as a more significant interest in a particular field, and it shows well as you begin to go through interviews and seek opportunities. And so Jack did get involved, and he loved it. He loved the research that he was doing. He loved the teams that he worked with. And ultimately, he was co-author or lead author on 22 published research papers.
He wasn't forced to do it. He loved it. He loved the learning part of it. He loved being part of the team. But he was young and he was new. Shouldn't there have been a stop? Shouldn't someone have said, hey, Jack, I think you're taking on a little too much. I don't know.
There are risk factors in the medical education setting. That would be a very good example of a risk indicator where someone is spending so much time above and beyond the normal schoolwork and the tests and the studying and so forth, because this became very time consuming. Jack was very willing to do this and he was excited to do these things, but it was grueling. Mm-hmm. And you couple that with what might be deemed the normal amount of learning and the complexity of the material and the studying and the testing with these research projects and the data slicing and the research interpretation, and then this very onerous process to seek publication with a medical journal. Much of that would arise very suddenly. Deadlines, we need to get this turned around for the review board, etc. 2 a.m, Jack would put aside his studies. He would just jump on it, and that was who he was. And so collectively, Jack was in a situation where he just had a lot of studying, a lot of work, and the research just added to that, and that just was, it was a very big burden. That was something that he struggled with. There are other aspects of medical school that collectively weigh on an individual. And so students like Jack, who have these immense situations of pressure and studying and understanding where I need to be and how do I get on this team, and then you add the research, they're already in a very sort of vulnerable, heightened state of just pressure.
You see all of these calls for action. This is not a Jack singular issue. Just this morning I woke up and heard of another loss by suicide. Mm-hmm. This is an epidemic in medicine. There are certain contributing factors in the way we train individuals that create environments where stress, anxiety, sleep deprivation all contribute or layer to poor well-being and poor outcomes. In what ways did Jack help seek in medical school, and what barriers were present in medical school to seeking that help?
So Jack did seek out a learning specialist or a learning coach, and he was able to find one, but it's off campus. And time is so precious. And he had so many other things going on. He'd have to make an appointment and maybe have to wait because it didn't fit with his schedule. And he enjoyed it. He went when he could. It wasn't often. He couldn't take time away from class or study, but he did, and it was good. It was good for him. It helped him organize his time and be sure that he was taking breaks, and that was really good. We encouraged him, and he wanted to seek a psychiatrist and an internist where he was going to school. But once he looked into it, he truly felt that it wasn't private, that it wasn't confidential. They're all affiliated with the school, the hospitals, the doctors. He just felt that anyone could go into his file. And he was concerned that if word got out that he was seeing a psychiatrist for medication or just a checkup, that would be a strike against him. It would be reported in his file. It would affect his recommendations, and that was a huge concern. So he wouldn't do it. He would not do it. He stuck with his doctors here in Los Angeles, and when he would come home, he would do a checkup or a check-in, but he would not seek help there or let it be known that he needed help.
I think there are those barriers that, in the experience that Jack had and in talking to many of his friends since we lost Jack and talking to graduates, it became clear that it's oftentimes just very unsafe to reach out and to get help for something like a depression or mental disability. And where there is an absence of trust that will be confidential, or where there is an absence of communication of here's where your data will be, or here's how we guard it. It will not go on your record. These are high achievers, aspirational. They're smart. And if they don't have that information and it's perceived to be very unsafe to seek help, they will internalize that and they will show themselves as coping. They will just convince you they're coping when they're not, when they need help. And that's the tragedy. That's the tragedy of not having an environment that normalizes the conversation about, let's talk about depression. Let's talk about what we know is happening to medical students, the stress. Let's talk about anxiety.
And Jack, in this kind of roadmap of instances of depression, it had never risen to the point where there was ever a suicide attempt before in his history.
No.
And he sought help. It was resolved.
Yes.
And so there was this
no
positive history of help seeking. There was this positive history of interacting with the mental health providers. So in that situation, the only difference is the environment in which he is seeking help.
Yes. In Jack's history, he never reached a crisis. It was never emergent. Yes, you are correct. I hadn't thought of it that way.
Yeah. So we talk about this phenomena of fish in a pond and all the fish are dying. And we say, gosh, what's wrong with these fish? And we never stop to think about the water. And it's the same analogy we use for medical education. If you're taking people who are generally healthy, Jack didn't come to medical school at high risk of dying by suicide.
Right.
Like you said, you'll never know why we're not blaming medical education. But what we are saying here today is that there are things, there are ways in which we train physicians that are inhumane. And they are designed specifically to lead to shame and to building resilience. But to what end? Resilience doesn't need to be built through shaming someone on the wards, yelling at people. That's just not an appropriate behavior for anyone under any circumstance. Creating an environment where the idea of getting help is feared.
There is this lack of confidence and lack of trust that this is a safe environment. And at the same time, just knowing the potential cost of people finding out or people making a judgment and what that would do to your prospects. That cost is so high that even knowing there may be safeguards, you simply can't establish the trust because it isn't made clear. Students will take that to mean there's risk, and they will not share, they will not trust. And the tragedy is that those things get internalized. Mm-hmm. The aggressions that aren't reported, the inability to seek help, they just are borne by the individual. And that creates this perception that they just need to be stoic and they just need to be strong.
And resilient.
And resilient. Mm-hmm. And so this whole notion of self-compassion just goes out the window. If I'm not able to succeed in this environment, I must be failing. Mm-hmm. Because I need to take this on by myself. And I think that's part of what Jack went through, was just having so much internalized that he felt was his responsibility.
It's the culture.
Navigating the rigors of medical training is a challenging journey for any student, but it can be especially daunting for those living with mental health conditions. As you've heard from John and Jennifer Ruddell, Jack had a history of successfully managing his depression, seeking help when needed. However, once he entered medical training, the landscape shifted, and he worried that should he seek help, it might jeopardize his future in medicine. Dr. Justin Bullock, a physician and mental health advocate, has been candid about his personal experiences with bipolar disorder, suicidality, and suicide attempts. In this episode, he returns to reflect on John and Jennifer's account of Jack's experience, shedding light on why students fear seeking help and the consequences when that fear takes hold.
I want to speak about these fears that Jack had, that his parents tell us about, and to share why I believe these fears are actually very well founded as a trainee in medical education. The first fear that I've heard is the fear of lack of privacy. When I was an intern, I attempted suicide, and it happened outside of work. Work had actually been going very well. I attempted suicide at home and called 911 sometime into my attempt. And I was brought to the same hospital that I train at. And it was there that this deep lack of privacy began, where my entire residency knew that I was admitted in the hospital. There were no steps taken to protect my identity. I have a sheet of paper where I reflected on what had happened to me in the hospital. And in it, I wrote that one of my friends came down to see me in the hospital, my best friend. And the ER doctors were mad because she was there and not respecting my privacy. And she was mad because she was there because they did not take steps to protect my privacy. The second fear that I hear is this fear of repercussions. And in my case, after my admission to the hospital, rumors about that admission had spread. And in fact, I was eventually forced into an evaluation to assess my fitness for duty. And the evaluation team used rumored information about me that was actually false. The information was that my co-resident found me down at home, when in reality, I actually called 911. And that information was used as evidence of the severity of my impairment. I was forced to do this evaluation after having already done an outpatient program where I got in treatment and been cleared by therapists and psychiatrists to return to work. I personally don't know any of my peers who've had any health issues or leaves of any types who were forced through this. As I went through this process, there was a complete lack of transparency, which in a time of mental crisis felt incredibly cruel. For 3 months, I sat alone at home, and I would, out of the blue, get email instructions with something that I had to do immediately. First, it was I had to sign releases of information for every mental health doctor in every hospital that I had ever been to. Days later, it was a mandatory hair, blood, and urine drug test. Next was an extensive psychiatric evaluation, one in which I felt pressure that I had to share every detail about my life Otherwise, I would not be allowed to return to becoming a physician. And finally, after weeks to months of waiting at home alone, I finally met with a committee. This committee, which was made up of multiple people, but notably no psychiatrist. And as a requirement to come back to work, even though it was found that I hadn't said anything untruthful, that I had been adherent to all of my treatment, was that I was forced to do a form of therapy, which I did not want to do, which I felt was clinically inappropriate. And this would require me to get a new therapist. And this time, I really wish that I hadn't called 911. And as I reflect on this, I reflect on the fact that I'm someone who actually studies identity. And I reflect on how the physician identity is so incredibly powerful that many people, including myself, would often rather die than lose this identity. I loved medical school. I loved residency. I love the research that I get to do. But throughout the course of being socialized into our medical profession, this love of medicine becomes equated to self-harm. To be a physician means to neglect one's body and oneself in service of others, the most noble of causes. The only reason that I did not try to kill myself as I was going through fitness for duty was one, because of my incredible support system. But two, as I sat there at home for months in the middle of the COVID pandemic, I eventually had to accept that even if I would never be a doctor ever again, I would still find a way to help people and to positively impact the world. I believe that I still would be Justin, even if I lost that doctor identity. And that allowed me to take some distance between this physician identity and the self-harm that I am so deeply familiar with.
Disclosing a mental health disability or seeking help in medical training is a deeply personal decision, often requiring a careful weighing of risks and benefits. On one hand, the hope of accessing support and accommodations, offering a chance to better manage one's mental health. On the other, there's the fear of stigma, being perceived as less capable, and concerns that disclosure could limit future opportunities. In the high-pressure environment of medical education, where resilience and stoicism are often valued over vulnerability, students must navigate this complex terrain. The decision to seek help can have long-term implications, not just for their career, but also for their sense of self. We asked Roja, Jack's friend and later partner, if she believed Jack feared losing opportunities if faculty were aware of his disabilities or depression.
I definitely think he feared it. I think we all feared it. Any level of vulnerability within the school system would put you at a disadvantage, because the people who just show up the strongest, who publish the most papers, who are willing to work the hardest, those are the qualities that were respected and rewarded formally, but also informally. And the other opportunities, like getting to be in certain surgeries and be able to be hands-on or be the medical student who was invited to certain presentations that were additional work on top of what's an already difficult workload. It's definitely given to the people that kind of embody those characteristics where they think you'll thrive in the environments. And one of those underpinnings for thriving in the environments tends to be, well, it's a hard environment, so you better be really strong. And the interpretation of strong often does not mean or incorporate disability.
Even after Jack's passing, this fear was still present and magnified by the power dynamics of the institution, creating an environment where she felt vulnerable and unsupported.
what I was put through in transitioning back to medical school. It was weaponizing trauma that I had gone through that they were in part also accountable for.
I am so sorry that happened to you. You seem like such a strong, independent person, and at the same time, you shouldn't have to be a super strong person in this type of situation.
I should have been supported. And to be clear, I was very supported by family and friends, and I would have expected a lot more, or I would have hoped for a lot more support from a place I had been for 7 or 8 years for undergrad and medical school.
How did your classmates feel? Did anyone seek help?
A couple of my friends started seeing therapists, or usually outside of the school. Even people who got therapy or saw a psychiatrist, they would worry that their medical records wouldn't necessarily be that protected, where technically someone might be a school administrator, but they also are a licensed practicing clinician and physician in the state. And not that people are opening up your medical records, but you just never know who's going to see you on a scheduling list. And I know for a fact that that's why Jack did not transition some of his care, because he felt more comfortable in his patient protected rights being protected in California, where he grew up and where he had long established care. And it might be because some sort of letter goes back to like the primary care doctor, who might be based in the health services department. And then there's communication from that to the medical school. And I think that's more of what it is like there are chains of anything that's internally related to the school. You should assume the school has visibility into it, which is terrifying.
One of the biggest stressors that any medical student has is a series of exams that are referred to as the boards, the USMLE Step 1, Step 2, Step 3. This was one of Jack's biggest stressors, and it was deeply tethered to his disability and getting accommodations and the struggle to do that and the additional loops to go through. But he had just completed the exam. And he did exceptionally well, we now know. But when the Ruddells drove him to the airport and put him on the plane, the sense that they had was that he was relieved and he felt accomplished and that he was in a good space. And as you know, and we know, unfortunately, I think it was a week later, they got the call that no parent ever is prepared to get. Can you give us a sense of what happened in that difference between them putting him on the plane and November 1st?
The laser focus that goes into studying for an exam like STEP and the level of pressure that Jack put himself under in order to get the scores that he was quote unquote told that he needed. I remember things like him saying, one of my mentors told me all of this research and all of this work would just be pointless if you don't at least get a 245 on Step 1. And I think he took those things to heart. I don't think they were meant in a you are worthless way, but I know he took those things to heart. And what that meant was, and just for who Jack was when he was in the mode of studying for something and really focusing on something, he always went and got it done. And I think he turned the blinders off to everything else that was difficult or hard in life in order to force himself to focus on that exam. But I think the reality is these things are so multifactorial. He wasn't sleeping well during the period of time that he was studying for STEP, not just because of the stress of the exam itself, but the stress of other life situations he was going through. And all of these things had taken a toll on him. And those were things that I know when he came back were all of a sudden again now top of mind, because we had a couple conversations about those, but they were things that he was compartmentalizing and things where when he would talk about it, he could rationalize it, but things that he didn't really share that openly. None of us knew the degree to which those things were happening because he wanted to protect us from it.
Navigating the complexities of medical training is challenging on its own, but for students with disabilities, these challenges often multiply. Securing accommodations, essential for some learners to succeed, can be a lengthy, stressful, and frustrating process. Jack Ruddell, like many others, encountered significant obstacles while seeking accommodations for his lifelong disability. What could have been a routine extension of his previous board exam accommodations became an exhausting ordeal filled with delays and uncertainty, adding immense pressure to an already demanding time. Dr. Meeks speaks with Jennifer and John Ruddell about this experience and the toll it took on Jack as he navigated this difficult process.
For the learning disability, Jack engaged with the accommodation office at his medical school. Is that correct?
He did. So when Jack began his first year, he had accommodations for extra time. And that was a carryover from his undergrad, although he did go in and have it approved. And so in his mind, it was approved. He took his Step 2 exam prior to his Step 1, and he had accommodations. When he was studying for and ready to take his Step 1 exam, he had a halt on that as he was informed that he had timed out of his accommodations. So here's Jack ready to take his exam, and he's timed out. So he had to cancel that. And you have to understand, Jack, for him, first of all, it's a financial loss. And second of all, now what am I going to do? Huge time loss. So Jack is very afraid that he will be denied because he's been reading and researching it, and he is understanding that accommodations at this time have become harder to get. So he has to reapply. It's an arduous process. So he has to find all of his old applications, find old forms, look up his past history, and find a doctor who is going to reassess him in a timely manner because he's running out of time.
And that's in and of itself, as I'm sure you know.
It's a
grueling process.
It's a grueling process.
To find the doctor, to go, to take the time, and you just lay everything bare, and you take tests, and you're assessed, and it's a 7-hour, I believe, in his case, it was this grueling commitment, and then you're done, and then
you wait.
You wait for months until you find out whether you have accommodations.
The pressure to succeed in medical education can be relentless, with the bar for entry into competitive residency programs constantly being raised. Despite changes like making Step 1 pass-fail to reduce stress, many students still feel immense pressure to stand out. The focus has simply shifted, pushing students to excel in other areas, like research and extracurriculars, just to remain competitive. Dr. Muller reflects on how this pressure has intensified, while Dr. Gold discusses how it impacts students' well-being, turning medical education into a constant race where even small achievements are seen as critical to success.
Step 1 is pass-fail now. I don't think our students are studying any less for Step 1 than they used to. They're freaked out that they might not pass. Our pass rate in our medical school, it's a very, 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 very high number. It's the whole point was making it pass fail. There's something else in the ether. There's something else, and it's us, of course, right? When you don't know what that thing is, all you need to do is look in the mirror because it's been there the whole time. And as a community, we can't seem to let go. And you know what it's like. The smaller your subspecialty of interest, the crazier the world around you gets. But you really have to be that much smarter to be an X. The students feel it, and they bear that burden every single day. You know, in some specialties, they're told, if you're not publishing papers in the double digits, well into the double digits, don't even bother applying. It's just not going to make a difference. If all of that was really necessary, if it was really meaningful and really important and excruciatingly hard to accomplish, but really meaningful and necessary and important, I or we might feel a little differently than the alternative, which is the reality. And that is that getting 2 percentile points higher on your boards and publishing all those papers, I hate to say it, it's just not that meaningful. It just wasn't necessary. It's not the yardstick by which we measure the quality of a physician or a scientist. It just isn't. And so we put them on this treadmill and we keep cranking up the speed.
There are always tests in this field, and that is always going to be a challenge if you're a person who puts a lot of pressure on yourselves on tests, because they always are there. There's significant deferred sort of anxiety around other things, because if you can't look at my scores to compare me and you have to compare me, I'm going to do 75 extracurriculars and 100 papers. And then you have all of this and no one can beat me. When are you going to class if you're doing 75 papers? We are deferring that competitive need and anxiety to these other things because we have to have it somewhere, unless we explicitly know how they're picking people for residency programs, which we don't. It's not transparent. And so what you know is there are X slots. I want one of them. How do I get that? They took the test score away. So now what? And probably advising tends to be part of the contributing factor there. We tend to tell them they have to pad and they have to do more, and there's always more. We're told to be competitive in this space to do well. We have a lot of competition in our brains. We have a lot of perfectionism in our brains and a lot of desire to one up someone because that's what they told us we had to do. Until we have enough residency spots for everyone who wants to do the field, I can't imagine it changes. The fact that people can get into med school, which is hard in itself, and then somehow not get to be a doctor, that's not good for anyone's mental health because you already had to be stressed to get into the field in the first place. The fact that a computer decides where you move can't possibly be good for your mental health. A lot of our processes require some thought.
The period surrounding high-stakes exams can be incredibly daunting for medical students. The pervasive message that these exams can determine a student's future isn't confined to specific schools. It's been a prevalent reality across medical education. In her essay, Murky Waters, first published in the Annals of Internal Medicine in 2018, Dr. Catherine Lapidus reflects on her own experiences and those of her peers as they navigated the intense aftermath of their board exams. She begins by reading the first 2 paragraphs of her essay, which include material related to suicide. Please be aware that this content may be distressing for some listeners and readers, so proceed with caution.
I jumped as my pager beeped loudly, announcing that the United States Medical Licensing Examination Step 1 scores had been posted. My heart was pounding and my hands were sweating as I frantically searched the hospital for a private computer to check my score. Scenes of lectures from the first 2 years of medical school flashed in my mind, reminding me that the score of this one test would determine my future life as a physician. Leaders of our school spoke of the test the way rabbis spoke of the decree in the Book of Life on Yom Kippur. They declared that this test would decide who would succeed and who would struggle with mediocrity, who would choose their specialty and who would scramble to fill empty slots, who would live in the same location as their loved ones, and who would be separated. Failure was not an option. I took a deep breath, scrolled to the score, and saw that I had passed. My score was mediocre. On this day, self-doubt overwhelmed me, as it did most of my classmates. I cried alone in my car. After some kind words from friends and family, I eventually composed myself. I was emotionally exhausted, and I cannot remember anything else from that day except for the email from school informing us that our classmate Sarah had died. I immediately thought back to how terrible I felt before and directly after I got my score. I thought about the possibility that Sarah had been overwhelmed by the same anxiety and adrenaline and had taken her own life. I hoped with all my heart that I was wrong. The next day, a meeting was held to discuss Sarah's death. My worst fears were realized: suicide. Our administrator explained that Sarah had been with friends that morning, doing rounds at the hospital. They decided to separate for lunch, check their scores in private, and meet up afterward. Sarah gave a friendly goodbye. She was oriented to the future, mentioning an appointment to pick up a new pager that afternoon and laughing that she had dropped hers in the toilet the day before. Minutes later, Sarah called 911, reported, "I'm going to kill myself," and hung up. She was gone before the ambulance arrived. Next to her body lay her laptop, displaying the results of her examination. She had failed by 1 point. I wish that I could have stopped her. I wish that I could have told her that this test did not matter, and she would still have a great life and be a great doctor.
As we close this episode, we return to the conversation between Dr. Meeks and the Ruddells, where she asks if they had any concerns about Jack entering medical school. Did they know about the heightened risks to mental health or the increasing rates of suicidal ideation among medical trainees? The reflections are both honest and heartbreaking, revealing the assumptions they made and the information they wished they'd had.
When Jack was getting ready to go to medical school, did you have any concerns about him entering medical training? Had you heard any of the rumblings about the increased impact on mental health, the increased odds of suicidal ideation? Were those any concerns that you either knew about or had?
No. No. We knew there would be great stress. There was a lot to learn. There was a lot of information to gather, but we had never heard of any stressors or anything of suicidal ideation or that it would impact him mentally or increase any of his distresses. Or we just hadn't.
Yeah. We knew that Jack being Jack would take on the challenge. Medical school is very difficult, that's clear. And that explained in part why Jack really wanted to seek that challenge and to take that course. And so we were aware of the environment in terms of being a very challenging one. And we knew that, as difficult as it may be, that we would always have that connection with Jack and that he would reach out, which he did.
And he had a support system. He had a psychiatrist here. He had an internist here. He had people that he could talk to. Jack had a very large and extended family, aunts and uncles and his brothers, and he wasn't afraid to Jack was honest. He wasn't afraid to talk about his feelings. So, no, that had not entered my mind. He was going to a medical school where they are taught how to take care of people. I guess I was just naive. I truly assumed that he would be as taken care of there as they're teaching him to take care of others.
We found that wasn't the case. How can this happen? How can this happen to our son, which is a totally different realm of our grief? But to come across the research, the articles, the published data on the tragedy of the losses of students, or just the loss of their well-being.
And these are dated 2014. Years ago.
Yeah.
It's a heartbreak.
It's a heartbreak.
And had we read any of those articles, it could have been an awakening. I can't go backwards, but I wish I had read those articles. I wish I'd had that information. And I am terribly saddened, and it needs to change.
It needs to.
The environment needs to change.
As we close today's episode, we reflect on the powerful and deeply emotional conversations shared by Jack Ruddell's parents, John and Jennifer, and our experts who have reflected on the struggles that medical trainees face. These narratives underscore the urgency of addressing mental health in medical education, an environment where extraordinary pressure, high expectations, and a culture where it can feel like help seeking is discouraged can have devastating consequences. The purpose of this series is not just to bring awareness to the challenges that learners face, but to advocate for systemic change. No student should feel that seeking help will jeopardize their career, and no student should feel isolated or ashamed for experiencing mental health struggles. As we've heard throughout this episode, the stakes are far too high to maintain a status quo that perpetuates harm. In the next episode, we shift our focus from how medical training contributes to the mental health decline in learners to exploring how we can break the cycle. This solutions-focused episode introduces Dr. Stuart Slavin, Vice President for Wellbeing at the Accreditation Council for Graduate Medical Education, the ACGME, and features insights from all of our experts, as well as reflections from the Ruddells and Dr. Meeks. Remember, if you or someone you know is struggling with mental health or suicidal thoughts, please reach out for support. Call or text 988 for the Suicide and Crisis Lifeline. You are not alone.
This episode was sponsored by the Docs with Disabilities Initiative. Executive producers of this episode include me, Dr. Lisa Meeks, Riley Betchkull, and John and Jennifer Ruddell, alongside our consulting psychiatrist and narrator, Dr. Joseph Murray. We encourage schools and programs to utilize content from this series for educational purposes in partnership with a mental health professional.